I stood in the middle of a lavish banquet hall in Atlanta with the dim glow of chandeliers polishing every smile into triumph. And the brightest of them belonged to my younger brother, Jake. Today was our father's 60th birthday, but it was also the night now answering to Mason Lawson because the name Tyler felt like a skin they could shed. Learned in public that a decade of work could be erased with a microphone and a nod. Lawson BBQ, once a hand-painted shack off the highway, had become a $50 million brand. And yet I was presented to 300 guests as a relic. The guy who kept the warehouse lights on while visionaries steered the ship. My father, Henry, stood beside Jake and dipped his head in a small assent that broke whatever was left of my certainty. I left without a scene, the applause still rising behind me. The photo album I had made for Dad heavy in my coat like a brick of memory. On the sidewalk, the night air carried that old phantom of wood smoke, apple cider vinegar, and the faint sweetness of honey. And I remembered why I had stayed when others left. My childhood smelled like sauce steam and fresh labels. My palms grew calloused on the paddle I used to stir the vats while Dad taught me to taste for balance. He was a craftsman, not a financier, raised poor, trained by my grandmother's patient hands. He talked in flavors, not projections, and when my mother died of breast cancer, grief folded him over the pot while I, a quiet child, measured the spices in the same order she had. Jake grew up as if the shop were a small town he planned to outgrow. He was bright, fast, and allergic to the smoke that clung to us. The first time he said he would not smell like ribs forever, he was 10 and fearless. I did not argue because it felt right that someone would leave and someone would keep the fire. When he earned Wharton, Dad's pride turned the neighborhood into a chorus for the one who would go far. I went to community college nearby and came home after class to fix leaks, test lids, and count jars. We covered tuition with long weeks and late invoices, and when the bills stacked taller than Dad's patience, I made a promise I would later keep. Our sauce would travel farther than the county line without losing the soul we brewed in that tin-roofed light. I refined the recipe, kept the bold tang from Grandma, softened the edges, added just enough smoke to linger, moved us into glass that sealed flavor, rented a scuffed warehouse, and slept there to catch the first sputter of second-hand machines. The first production run failed and bled back through cracked lids. I apologized to every grocer who would listen, then drove 2 hours to the Kroger manager who finally said yes to 500 jars for Georgia stores. We sold those, then 5,000, then 50,000. The South lit up in purchase orders, and eventually Walmart called to put Lawson BBQ on national shelves. I learned the hard arithmetic of supply and the soft calculus of trust. And for 5 years we climbed from a shack to a $10 million enterprise. I didn't ask for a spotlight. I wanted Dad to sleep easier and taste the future in a clean spoon. The cost was the life I did not live. I had no room for dinners or courtship. I kept a change of shirts under my desk and woke to spreadsheets. Dad returned to the old counter most days, his smile thinner, his back curving, and I imagined that growth made him feel like a guest in a house he built. I told myself that proof of love was progress and that he would see me. When Jake swept into the office smelling of new wool and New York winters, he looked like the magazine articles he would later collect. He said he had come to build the family legacy, and I believed him. Dad kissed his forehead in public and announced the strategist had arrived. I was asked to stay in my lane, keep production humming, let marketing dream. I swallowed it. Because swallowing had become my family language, I made the sauce hold. I patched Jake's leaps when distributors missed trucks and ad budgets doubled our blender spend. I watched the stories he told award him our origin. And I kept quiet because the jars still left the dock and customers still wrote about the taste of home. Then came the night of the speech and the demotion dressed as a toast, and the cold street afterward where I decided to speak in actions instead. I booked Chicago 2 weeks later because a competitor called with a sentence I had not heard from my own family in years. "We need you." Smoky Trails was all glass and card access and a lobby smell of nothing. There were no smoke ghosts in the ductwork. They gave me an office, a team, and a budget without scolding. But I asked for a lab and a warehouse floor first because that is where truths are born. Their sauces were competent but hollow. The sweetness burred the tongue. The smoke was a costume, not a burn earned by wood. I rebuilt their line around an idea close to my grandmother's notebook, but tuned for modern tables, anchoring tang with pepper and a dry chile echo. I stood over steel kettles until my eyes watered, and the memory of the Georgia shack warmed my fingers. We called it Blaze because even marketing understood that fire, if honest, explains itself. I mapped suppliers with redundancies and timed trucks to shelves, so the sauce never tasted like a trip it should not have taken. I persuaded Walmart, once our pride, to try exclusivity with Blaze for a spell by promising consistency at scale better than they had suffered from us in the last year. When the line launched, we counted reorders faster than projections, and within 6 months, diners said the word authentic without being coached. Food writers noticed, then accountants. And I allowed myself a small smile in a small kitchen apartment because somewhere back home a panic must have stirred. I didn't hate them for that flicker of satisfaction. I recognized it as the body's way to balance a ledger of humiliation. Lawson BBQ began to leak market share like a cracked jar. Supermarkets trimmed facings. Restaurants that once bragged about our name replaced us under heat lamps. A trade magazine ran a headline that crowned Smoky Trails the new leader in the category. And a Forbes profile framed Jake as a visionary still. But the lines inside between my name and the words product, process, and supply grew longer. I did not call Dad. I didn't send a triumphant text to my brother. I pulled the photo album from the closet and turned pages as if the paper could answer how a century of family flavor could become a press release. The picture that stopped me was the one where Dad and I stand outside the old shack, sunlight striping his face through the awning slats, his hand on my shoulder, both of us glazed with heat. I missed him so badly the room felt smaller. The Chicago winter laid its gray palm over the city and took my appetite. When the phone rang with his name, I stared at it long enough to hear the second buzz. I answered because even exiles listen when a father calls. His voice was hoarse and older and naked with fear. He said the company was failing, distributors folding their arms, shelves thinning, contracts canceled, and he used we like a life raft he wanted me to climb onto. He asked me to come home. I waited for the sentence that would unspool the knot I had learned to ignore, a sentence that said he saw me, but he offered responsibility without recognition. I told him I would help under conditions that would protect the work, a majority stake to steady governance. Jake learning the business ground up, not as punishment, but as training. He hung up to think and called back angry enough to use the word traitor. After that, Jake called to shout about theft and loyalty and the future he would save without me. I did not raise my voice. I wished him luck. The line went dead, and the first true quiet in years filled the room. A year passed and proved that momentum without craft is a mirage. I said yes to a lecture at Wharton titled The Power of the Underestimated because I wanted to stand in the building that had once rewritten my brother into a hero and speak for the hands that stir vats and the minds that route trucks. By then, Smoky Trails had widened its lead. Blaze traveled into Canada, and I had a title that sounded grand because it was earned, Chief Product Officer. The markets loved regularity. The press loved a story of the man misjudged. I told the auditorium what any honest craftsperson knows. That reputation is built in unglamorous hours and preserved by consequences you face when no one else will. While I talked, somewhere in Georgia, the accountant's math finished its slow betrayal, and Lawson BBQ collapsed into auctions and leases. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote a eulogy with numbers and size. An old floor manager texted me a photograph of the warehouse door chained shut, and I carried my phone like a hot pan into the cold air. I did not toast victory. I sat on a bench and missed the sound the sauce makes when it first breaks into a boil, a soft, happy thrum. I didn't call Dad to say I told you. I didn't call Jake to say we could have done this together. A chef I respected in Chicago slid a plate in front of me the next week with ribs lacquered in Blaze and smiled in that quiet approval working men give one another. He asked about the first time I knew a recipe could travel without losing itself, and I told him it was the day a trucker hugged my father after buying a second jar. The chef said that if I ever wanted to put my name on a small batch, he would clear a shelf and let it sell until it sold out. I said not yet, because the name Lawson still shook in my chest like a ladder someone else had kicked. I started seeing a therapist every Thursday at exactly 06:30 p.m., who never pushed forgiveness as a job, but taught me to name what I felt without apology. She said that sometimes pride is a coat we wear because the night is colder than we admit. She asked me to write a letter to my father I had no plan to send. It began with, "I wanted to make you proud," and ended with, "I'm done auditioning for a part I already played." Somewhere in Florida, Jake took a job at a small firm outside the headlines and learned what it meant to answer to a manager who read numbers without adverbs. He stopped appearing on panels about innovation. He stopped appearing at all. The quiet between us grew old enough to have its own habits. The album on my desk gathered a thin coat of dust that I refused to wipe away because even dust is a record of time and air. When Wharton sent me a thank you note with a list of students who wanted internships, I forwarded 2 of them to the Smoky Trails operations team and told them to start in warehouses, not boardrooms. One of them later wrote that the smell of spice never left her clothes that summer, and that she had never felt more useful than when she solved a pallet routing error at midnight with a borrowed forklift and sheer clarity. The world kept moving, as it does when our personal dramas call themselves epic. And I kept my promises to the work because I cannot imagine living any other way. Some nights I wake shaking with the dream I cannot finish, Dad at the pot again, wooden spoon in hand, looking up as if to ask who I have become. In the dream I tell him the truth. I am the sum of nights no one watched and mornings no one narrated. I am the man who learned to receive contempt without surrender, who learned to turn insults into orchestration. In those hours I open the album and let the pictures talk. There I am delivering the first order to Kroger, sleeves rolled, a grin I barely recognize. There is Dad at the old counter telling a customer that the sauce tastes like Sunday. There is Jake as a teenager leaning on the doorframe, half in, half out of our life, curious and already impatient. I've tried, with limited success, to locate tenderness that does not excuse harm. It is possible to remember a good man's good years and still refuse the lie he believed about you. It is possible to love a brother and never again accept his version of your story. Once, in a quiet season when Blaze ran like clockwork and review cycles ended early, I rented a car and drove back to the highway exit where the shack had stood. In its place, a franchise sat square and cheerful with laminated menus. I parked across the street, rolled the window down, and breathed. The air did not smell like apple cider vinegar anymore. It smelled like asphalt and promise and a small grief I named but didn't feed. I drove to the old neighborhood and walked past a yard where we had once set up picnic tables for a summer sale. And an older neighbor waved with the comfortable recognition people reserve for the children they remember. She said she still had one of our jars, empty but saved for toothpicks, and I almost cried in the middle of the sidewalk. I didn't knock on my father's rented apartment door because I was not yet ready to hear that silence in person. Instead, I wrote another unsent letter I read to my therapist at exactly 06:30 p.m. that Thursday. She asked whether I wanted reconciliation or relief. I said I wanted to stop letdowns from surprising me. She nodded and said that naming a pattern is the first mercy we give ourselves. Work remained the one place I could tell the truth cleanly. We developed a sauce for a hospital system's dietetic program, low sugar and high flavor, because the head dietitian remembered her grandfather missing barbecue after his diagnosis at the pilot tasting. A man in a paper gown closed his eyes after a small bite and laughed. When he asked who made it, I raised my hand. He said to keep going. People like him needed to taste their lives again. I stood in the hallway afterward and realized that somewhere between ambition and grief, I had stumbled into the simplest mission of all, make food that lets people feel like themselves. News about Lawson BBQ's final liquidation found me through a former line supervisor who still called me boss, even though she had a title now that outranked anything she once held. She sent one picture of the auctioneer's hand mid-gesture and another of a pallet jack with our old logo peeling off the handle. I did not reply immediately. That night I cooked ribs in my apartment oven the way we used to on rainy days when the pit wouldn't cooperate, brushed them at the end with blaze. Then, with a small pan of an experimental reduction I'd been tinkering with that added a whisper of black coffee for depth, I ate them at the counter and cried without needing a reason more elaborate than this. A dream had completed its arc and fallen back to earth. The next morning, I sent the supervisor a note that said I was proud of the work we did and that she should never treat that pride as disloyalty to her new life. She wrote back that she and 3 others were starting a small co-packing facility and wanted advice, and I gave it freely because knowledge hoarded turned sour. Later that week, an email arrived from a nonprofit that ran culinary training for teens coming out of hard school years. They wanted guest instructors and asked if I would teach a session on taste memory. I told them yes and wrote a curriculum that started with the tongue but ended in the heart. I brought a photograph of the shack and explained how places get into recipes. I showed them how smoke is an ingredient and a story. And a boy with a cracked knuckle asked whether a person could have flavor even if no one seemed to notice. I said that flavor is the thing you carry when rooms don't invite you to speak. And his eyes watered because he understood. That afternoon, I walked past a grocery end cap where Blaze sat next to 3 other sauces I admired and felt something I had not allowed in a long time. Uncomplicated gratitude. Gratitude for the customers who never met me but trust my hand. Gratitude for the colleagues who hold standards with me. For the drivers who wake at unholy hours. For the QA tech who caught a mislabeled lot at dawn. I bought nothing. I stood there until a clerk asked whether I needed help, and I said I was just saying hello to old friends. At home, I wrote a final letter to Dad and finally sent it. I wrote that I loved him, and that my love no longer required his agreement about who I was. I wrote that I hoped his days were gentle and his nights smelled like the sauce that gave our life shape. I did not expect a reply. Days passed. Then a card arrived with his shaky handwriting and a sentence that did not fix anything but moved a piece inside me. He wrote that he had kept the album I had made that night at the hotel and that he opened it sometimes to remember the boy who saved him after Mom died. He did not apologize. He thanked me for the jars that traveled. I sat at the table and let the sun crawl across the floor and decided that sometimes the smallest mercy is enough. When Wharton invited me back again, I declined the lecture and offered a workshop instead. I asked for a room with sinks and burners. We cooked. We talked about the physics of kettles, the art of sourcing, the ethics of scale, and what to do when a partner's charisma blinds investors to the person keeping the lights on. I told the students that no document will save them from a family's myth if the family worships the wrong God, and that their backup plan must never be a person who refuses to see them. I told them to keep immaculate records not for revenge, but for memory. I told them that humility is not a pose, it is a practice of attention. Afterward, a student approached to say her father still thought she should marry the business rather than run it. I said to make the sauce so undeniable that even his friends stopped listening to him. At Smoky Trails, the board asked me to consider an expansion into rubs and marinades. I agreed on the condition that our smallest team would lead the first prototypes because they were closest to the line cooks we served. We piloted a dry rub that borrowed from the sauce's grammar and a marinade that worked fast without tasting rushed. Early results were good enough to expand slowly, and I thanked everyone by name in a memo because the only trophies that matter hang on the inside of your ribs. One evening, I walked to the lake just before 07:00 p.m. and watched the last bit of light on the water and thought about silence as a material. There is the silence of exile and the silence of wholeness. The first steals your air. The second fills your lungs. I felt the second for the first time in years. In that quiet, I made a private inventory. I had lost a company and a version of a father and a brother I once believed in. I had found a vocation that still startled me with its capacity to heal small corners of the world. I had learned to welcome praise without making it a drug. I had learned to grieve without making it a brand. I had learned that the work you do in the dark keeps you from becoming dark. Back home, I opened the album and tucked Dad's card inside the front cover. Under it, I placed a recipe card written in my grandmother's sudden script. A copy my aunt had mailed me after reading an article that mentioned me by name. The recipe matched my memory within a gram. On the back, she had scribbled a note that said, "You were always the one who tasted carefully." I traced the letters with my finger and decided to build a scholarship in Grandma's name for students who wanted to learn food production the hard way. The company matched funds without blinking. The first recipient sent a photograph of her mother holding a certificate. And I cried again, tired of apologizing for tears and refusing to stop them. I did not expect to see Jake again, but life writes in loops. He appeared at a food expo in a small booth hawking a startup's private label condiments. He noticed me, went pale, then straightened as if to reassemble himself. We shook hands like men who had once shared a bedroom and now shared a history neither could retell the same way. He said he heard I was doing well. I said I was doing honest work. He looked at Blaze and then at me and said he had underestimated what craft meant. I nodded because neither of us needed the sermon. He asked whether Dad had written to me. I said yes. He said he had gotten a shorter card and that he was thinking of driving up soon. I wished him a safe trip and meant it. Before we parted, he asked whether the sauce tasted like home to me. I said it tasted like the future because the past was no longer a place I lived. On the flight back, I wrote the talk I would never give and folded it into the album, a list of quiet instructions to my younger self. Start where you are. Count every jar. Protect your nights. Learn to say no with a steady voice. Do not let a headline steal a decade of truth. Ask your body what it knows that your pride ignores. Keep a spoon by the stove for visitors. Feed the people who show up when it rains. When we released a limited small batch in partnership with that Chicago chef, we put no name on the front but the truth of the ingredients, and it sold out in 2 days because flavor still outruns hype. I took 2 bottles to a hospital ward for that dietetic program and handed them to the man who had laughed months earlier. He hugged me with the careful gratitude of someone who remembers hunger. On the elevator down, a nurse asked whether I was the sauce guy. I said yes, and she said her father used to swear by Lawson jars back when he could eat anything, and that he would have liked Blaze, too. I told her I hoped he would try it someday, and she smiled the tired smile of people who carry others for a living. That night I dreamed the shack again, but this time Mom was alive and stirring, and Dad leaned in the doorway and watched us. I woke with the kind of peace that does not ask permission. I made breakfast at 07:15 a.m., eggs and toast, and wrote 3 thank you emails before work, one to the line supervisor who started the co-packer, one to the chef, one to the dietitian. Gratitude, it turns out, is also a supply chain you can build, and it delivers what it promises. I am not the boy at the counter anymore or the man who waits for the nod. I am a maker with the long memory of smoke and the short memory of insults. My family became a country I visit in letters, and that is enough for now. The album stays on my desk, not as an altar to pain, but as a ledger of love. The lesson my life insisted on giving is embarrassingly simple and therefore easy to forget. Value does not ask permission to exist. It does not require a stage or a toast. It asks for a promise and then demands you keep it when no one thanks you. If you are lucky, the world hears. If you are not, your work still matters because people you will never meet will eat dinner with their families and not know why the evening felt like home. Every jar of Blaze tells me I kept my word to a man who forgot how to see me, and to a younger self who knew how to taste carefully. I do not waste days rehearsing the speech I might have given at that hotel. I spend them building teams that will never have to beg a microphone to tell the truth. When I walk past the sauce aisle now, I do not count facings like a gambler. I whisper a prayer for anyone who is still stirring in the dark. If you are there tonight with a wooden spoon and a thin budget and a heart full of doubt, I am rooting for you. Finish the batch, label the lids, ship the pallets, keep the promise. It will add up in the only ledger that matters. And when the time comes to choose between applause and integrity, remember that applause stops and integrity sleeps beside you without making a sound. If a father cannot see you, learn to see yourself. If a brother takes your story, write another and live it so fully that borrowing becomes impossible. If your own name begins to ache, change it for a while and return to it when you're ready, or keep the new one and let it fit. I am Mason Lawson because I said so, and saying so was the first real gift I gave myself. I close the album some nights and still dream of stirring with my parents in a kitchen that never truly existed. But the dream does not punish me anymore. It reminds me that families are recipes too. And sometimes the only way to honor them is to cook something honest with what remains. If this story found you at a moment when you needed permission to begin again, take it. Begin. Like smoke. Your work will find the rooms it belongs in. If you listen closely, you will hear it. The soft, steady thrum of a life you built with your own hands, calling you home. If this story moved you, tap like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who needs a reminder to keep going. Subscribe for more true-to-life narratives about family, work, and second chances, and comment below with the moment you chose integrity over approval.